The desert air hung thick over Tucson that March evening in 1968, the kind of heat that made men's collars stick to their necks and turned ice cubes to water before the glass reached your lips. Dean Martin stood at the window of his hotel suite at the Arizona Inn, watching the sun bleed orange across the Catalina Mountains, a tumbler of scotch warming in his hand. He'd been in town 3 days shooting scenes for a western that would be forgotten before the year ended, one of those pictures where they paid you enough not to care about the script. The money was good. The work was easy. And that, Dean was beginning to understand, was precisely the problem. The knock came at 7:30, punctual as a church bell. Dean didn't turn from the window. He knew who it was. Only one man knocked like that, 3 solid raps that weren't asking permission so much as announcing arrival. "It's open," Dean called out, and John Wayne stepped into the room with the same unhurried certainty he brought to every entrance, whether the camera was rolling or not. Duke wore dusty jeans and a work shirt with pearl snaps, his face weathered from 2 weeks under the Arizona sun on location for his own picture shooting 20 miles outside town. He smelled like horses and honest sweat, and Dean caught himself straightening up slightly, as if the other man's presence demanded better posture. "You gonna offer me a drink or just admire the view all night?" Duke said, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow felt final. Dean moved to the bar cart, poured 2 fingers of scotch into a second glass, and handed it to Duke without a word. They stood there in silence for a long moment, 2 men who'd known each other 15 years, since Dean was still trying to prove he was more than Jerry Lewis's straight man and Duke was already an institution. They'd worked together twice, crossed paths at 100 industry parties, shared stages and golf courses and late nights when the talk turned philosophical and the liquor made honesty easier. But Duke hadn't driven in from location just to reminisce. That much was clear from the set of his jaw, the way he held his glass without drinking, his eyes studying Dean with an intensity that felt like judgment. "You look good," Duke finally said, but there was no compliment in it, just observation weighted with something else. "Too good for a man who's supposedly working." Dean took a long drink, let the burn settle in his chest before responding. "We wrapped at 4. Early day. I keep banker's hours now." He meant it as a joke, the kind of self-deprecating charm that usually diffused tension, but Duke didn't smile. Instead, he walked over to the coffee table where Dean's script lay face down, its pages pristine, not a mark of pencil or crease of study visible on the cover. Duke picked it up, flipped through it with the practiced eye of a man who'd read 10,000 scripts in his career, and set it back down with deliberate care. "When's the last time you stayed up past midnight working on a scene?" Duke asked. "When's the last time you showed up to set with ideas, with questions, with anything except your mark memorized and your salary negotiated?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Dean felt something tighten in his chest, something that wasn't quite anger but close to it, something defensive and raw. "I do my job," Dean said quietly, still facing the window, watching night claim the desert. "I show up on time, know my lines, hit my marks. That's what they pay me for. That's what the contract says." Duke moved beside him then, close enough that Dean could see his reflection in the darkening glass, 2 aging men in a hotel room far from Hollywood, far from the myth-making machinery that had built them both into something larger than life. "That's what hacks do," Duke said, and his voice wasn't cruel, wasn't even particularly harsh, just factual in the way a doctor might tell you about a tumor. "They show up, say the words, collect the check. And nobody remembers their names 5 years after they're gone." Dean turned then, finally meeting Duke's eyes, and what he saw there wasn't anger or contempt but something worse. Disappointment. "Is that why you came here? To tell me I'm a hack?" Duke took his first sip of scotch, considering his words with the same care he brought to choosing camera angles. "I came here because Frank called me yesterday. He's worried about you. Says you've been phoning it in for 2 years now, taking every job that comes along, not caring about the quality, just banking checks like you're afraid the well's gonna run dry." The mention of Sinatra hit harder than Dean expected, probably because Frank never worried about anyone unless the situation was serious, unless he saw something worth saving slipping away. "Frank's one to talk," Dean said, hearing the weakness in his own defense. "He does 3 pictures a year, half of them garbage. Duke nodded slowly, acknowledging the point. Yeah, he does. But when Frank cares about something, when he commits, he's brilliant. Ocean's 11, The Manchurian Candidate, From Here to Eternity. When he decides something matters, he's untouchable. The question isn't what Frank does with his throwaway pictures. The question is, when's the last time you cared enough to be brilliant? The words landed like body blows, precise and devastating, and Dean walked back to the bar cart, poured himself another drink he didn't need, buying time to organize thoughts that suddenly felt scattered and exposed. Outside, a police siren wailed somewhere in downtown Tucson, a distant reminder that the world kept turning whether you were paying attention or not. I was brilliant, Dean said finally, quietly, speaking more to himself than to Duke. Rio Bravo. Some came running. The young lions. I was good in those. I gave a damn. Duke's voice came from behind him, gentle now, almost paternal. That was 10 years ago, Dean. What about now? What about tomorrow? And there it was, the question Dean had been avoiding for months, maybe years, the question that woke him up at 3 a.m. when the scotch wore off and the house was silent and the awards on his mantel gathered dust in the dark. Dean turned slowly, leaning back against the bar cart, the glass cool in his hand. You want to know the truth? I'm tired, Duke. I'm tired of caring so much it hurts. I'm tired of fighting directors for better takes, tired of arguing with writers about motivation, tired of showing up at 6 a.m. to sit in makeup for 2 hours so I can pretend to be someone I'm not. I gave 25 years to this business, gave it everything, and what did it get me? A failed marriage, kids who barely know me, and a reputation as the drunk from the Rat Pack who made loving booze his brand. So yeah, maybe I'm phoning it in now. Maybe I'm just getting while the getting's good, banking that money so when they stop calling, when the offers dry up and I'm yesterday's news, I can sit in Palm Springs and not worry about where my next meal comes from. The words came out in a rush, months of private rationalization suddenly spoken aloud, and Dean felt both relief and shame at hearing himself articulate what he'd only thought in fragments before Duke set his glass down on the window ledge with a soft clink, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd walked the same road, faced these same demons, made his own accommodation with time and mortality and the brutal economics of Hollywood. You know what the difference is between you and me, Dean? It's not talent. You got as much as anyone I've ever worked with. It's not opportunity. We've both had more chances than we deserve. The difference is that I decided a long time ago that every picture matters, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones, because the work is all we leave behind. The money evaporates. The fame fades. The headlines turn yellow. But the work, good or bad, that's what they'll judge us by when we're gone. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let some film school kid 50 years from now watch my movies and say, he didn't care. You can see it in his eyes. He was just collecting a paycheck. Dean wanted to argue, wanted to mount a defense, but something in Duke's words had penetrated deeper than reason, had struck at something essential that Dean had tried to bury under cynicism and justified exhaustion. He thought about Rio Bravo, about working with Hawks and Duke and Ricky Nelson, about how alive he'd felt in those scenes, how every take mattered, how he'd go home at night and dream about the next day's work. He thought about the moment in that film where his character, Dude, breaks down crying over his own failure, and how that scene hadn't been acting at all but something real and vulnerable that Hawks had somehow coaxed out of him, something that made audiences believe he was more than just the smooth crooner with the easy charm. When was the last time he'd felt that way on a set? When was the last time he'd gone home thinking about tomorrow's scenes instead of tomorrow's tea time? You think I don't know this already? Dean said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by truth. You think I don't see it happening? Every morning I wake up and tell myself today's gonna be different, today I'm gonna bring something extra, today I'm gonna make them remember why they hired me in the first place. And then I get to the set and I see the script and I see the director who's more worried about lunch than the scene, and I think, what's the point? What's the point of caring about a picture that nobody else cares about, that'll play for 2 weeks in second-run theaters and then disappear forever? Duke moved closer, standing directly in front of Dean now, forcing eye contact, and his presence filled the room like a physical thing, undeniable and immovable. "The point is you," he said simply. "The point is walking away from every job knowing you gave it everything, whether it deserved it or not, because that's what professionals do. That's what artists do. You think every scene I shoot is gold? You think every picture I make is The Searchers? Hell no. But I show up every single day trying to make it that good, trying to find something true in the material, trying to give audiences their money's worth even when the studio doesn't give me anything to work with." Dean felt something crack inside him, some wall he'd built between who he'd been and who he'd become, and he turned away quickly, not wanting Duke to see whatever was happening on his face. He thought about his kids, about how they watched his movies and looked at him with a mixture of pride and confusion, proud of their famous father but confused by the difference between the man on screen and the man who missed their school plays because he was shooting in Mexico or recording in Vegas or just too tired to engage. He thought about his mother, dead 5 years now, who'd never understood Hollywood or fame but who'd understood work, who'd scrubbed floors and taken in laundry and raised 4 kids during the Depression, who'd taught him that how you did anything was how you did everything. What would she think of him now, collecting checks for performances he barely remembered giving? "You know what keeps me up at night?" Dean said, still facing away, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not the bad reviews or the forgettable pictures. It's the idea that I had something special once, something real, and I just pissed it away because it was easier to coast, easier to be charming Dean Martin who makes it look effortless than to be the guy who sweats and struggles and cares too much. I watch guys like Brando and Clift and even Frank when he's locked in, and I see them reaching for something that scares them, something that might fail spectacularly, and I realize I haven't scared myself in years. I've been playing it safe so long I forgot what it feels like to risk something, to really risk it, on screen." Duke's hand landed on his shoulder then, heavy and solid, the grip of a man who'd pulled himself and others out of darker holes than this. "Then stop," he said simply. "Stop taking the safe jobs. Stop saying yes to everything. Stop treating your career like a retirement fund and start treating it like a legacy." Dean turned back around, wiping at his eyes quickly, not caring anymore what Duke saw there. "What if I can't? What if I've forgotten how? What if that version of me, the one who cared enough to be great, what if he's gone for good?" Duke studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something softer than the tough love that had brought him here, something almost tender. "Then you do what every actor does when he's lost. You start small. You pick one scene, one moment in this throwaway picture you're shooting, and you make that moment great. Not for the director, not for the studio, not even for the audience. You make it great for you, because you need to prove to yourself you still can. And then tomorrow you do it again. And the day after that. And pretty soon you're not phoning it in anymore. Pretty soon you're the guy who cares again, who shows up with ideas and passion and hunger. That guy didn't die, Dean. He's just been sleeping. Time to wake him up." The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, 2 men in a hotel room far from home, having one of those conversations that changes the shape of a life, that becomes a before and after moment you measure time by. Dean thought about tomorrow's call sheet, a simple scene in a saloon where his character plays cards and makes a joke and exits stage left, forgotten as soon as the next scene starts. What if he didn't just do it? What if he found something in that throwaway moment, some gesture, or look or line reading that elevated it beyond the script, that made audiences lean forward and remember why they'd paid attention to him in the first place? What if he started there, with that one small moment, and built back toward the performer he'd once been, the one who'd stood on stage at the Copa and owned every second, the one who'd made Hawks believe he could anchor a Western alongside John Wayne and not get blown off the screen? "You drove 20 miles just to tell me this?" Dean asked, and for the first time that night, he felt something like gratitude cutting through the defensiveness and shame. Duke picked up his glass, drained the last of the scotch, and smiled, the first real smile he'd shown since arriving. "Frank called it a favor. But between you and me, I did it because Rio Bravo was one of the best times I ever had making a picture, and you're a big part of why. You were present in every scene, alive in every take, pushing me to be better even when you thought you were just keeping up. I miss that guy. Hollywood misses that guy. And I think you miss him too, whether you want to admit it or not. Dean felt the truth of it then, felt it in his bones the way you feel cold when the fever finally breaks, and he realized that Duke hadn't come here to lecture him or shame him but to throw him a rope, the way Chance had thrown Dude a rope in that movie, pulling him out of the mud and giving him a chance to be someone worth respecting again. "Thank you," Dean said simply, and meant it in a way that went beyond words, meant it for the friendship and the honesty and the refusal to let him disappear into comfortable mediocrity. Duke nodded once, set his glass down, and moved toward the door, but Dean stopped him with a question that had been building since the conversation started. "You ever get tired, Duke? You ever wake up and think maybe it's time to just walk away, take the money and the legend and let someone else carry the load?" Duke paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back to Dean, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every movie he'd made, every stunt that had bruised him, every early morning and late night that had stolen years from his life and given them to audiences who'd never know his name without the work. "Every damn day," Duke said quietly. "Every time my knees ache or my back seizes up or I read another script that's not worth the paper it's printed on. But then I think about some kid in Iowa or Georgia or California sitting in a dark theater, using his allowance money to escape whatever problems are waiting at home, and I think if I can give him 2 hours where he believes in heroes, where he believes courage and honor still mean something, then my tired doesn't matter. That kid matters. And whether I'm making The Searchers or some forgettable shoot 'em up in Tucson, I owe him my best, every single time. Because he's spending his money and his time believing in me, and that's a trust one won't betray, not ever, not for any reason." He opened the door then, letting the night air rush in, carrying the smell of desert sage and possibility, and looked back at Dean one last time. "You got talent, Dean. More than you give yourself credit for. But talent without dedication is just wasted potential. The question you gotta answer before you go to bed tonight is whether you're gonna waste what you got or honor it. That's not something I can decide for you. That's between you and the mirror." And then he was gone, boots echoing down the hallway, leaving Dean alone with his scotch and his thoughts and the reflection in the window glass showing a man who looked older than he remembered, more weathered, but maybe, just maybe, more awake than he'd been in years. Dean stood there for a long time after Duke left, not moving, not drinking, just thinking about Rio Bravo and the young lions and every other time he'd stepped in front of a camera and left something of himself in the performance, something that couldn't be faked or phoned in, something real. He thought about the famous story people always told about him, about how he made it all look effortless, how he'd do one take and nail it while everyone else struggled through multiple attempts. What people didn't understand, what he'd stopped explaining years ago, was that the appearance of effortlessness required enormous effort, required preparation and craft and absolute commitment to the illusion. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that. He'd started believing his own myth, believing that he could just show up and charm his way through anything. But Duke was right. Charm without substance is just con artistry, and audiences could smell the difference even if they couldn't articulate it. Dean walked to the phone, picked up the receiver, and dialed the operator. "Connect me to the director's room," he said. "Jack Finney." "Yes, I'll hold." While he waited, his heart beat faster, the way it used to before important takes, that mixture of nerves and excitement that meant something significant was about to happen. When Finney answered, sounding surprised and slightly annoyed to be called after hours, Dean spoke quickly before he could change his mind. "Jack, it's Dean. Listen, about that saloon scene tomorrow, the card game. I've been thinking about it, and I have some ideas. What if my character isn't just playing cards but actually cheating, and the tension in the scene comes from wondering if he'll get caught? We could add some business with the hands, some looks between the players, turn a nothing scene into something with stakes. You got 5 minutes to talk this through?" The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Dean thought maybe he'd overstepped, maybe Finney would tell him to stick to his job and let the director direct. But then Finney laughed, surprised and pleased, and said, "I got 5 minutes. Hell, I got all night if you're bringing ideas. Come down to my room. Let's work." Dean hung up, looked at himself in the mirror above the phone, and saw something he hadn't seen in a long time, a professional gearing up for work, an artist engaging with craft, a man who gave a damn. He grabbed his script off the coffee table, found a pen in the desk drawer, and headed for the door, already thinking about the scene, about character motivation, about how to make a moment that was supposed to be forgettable into something audiences would remember. Speed was temporary. The quick take, the effortless charm, the ability to nail it in one shot, all of that faded with age, with time, with the inevitable erosion that came for every performer. But skill lasted forever. Craft endured. The work, done with dedication and integrity and respect for the audience's faith, that survived long after the box office receipts and the reviews and the paychecks disappeared into history. 3 weeks later, Dean sat in a screening room at Warner Brothers, watching rough cuts of the picture he'd shot in Tucson, and when the saloon scene came up, the one he and Finney had reworked that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. The scene worked. More than worked. It elevated everything around it, gave his character dimension, created tension where there'd been none in the script. It wasn't The Searchers, wasn't going to win any awards, but it was honest work done well, and that mattered more than he'd remembered. The producer sitting beside him leaned over and whispered, "Whatever you're doing different, keep doing it." That's the Dean Martin I remember. Word got around Hollywood the way it always did, through agents and assistants and late-night phone calls between people who track reputations for a living. Dean turned down the next 3 scripts that came his way, passed on easy money because the material wasn't worth his time, and started reading for something that scared him, something that would force him to reach beyond charm and crooning into territory he'd been avoiding. 6 months after that night in Tucson, Dean signed on for Airport, a role that would introduce him to a new generation of audiences and remind the old generation why they'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The part wasn't large, but it was solid, required real acting instead of persona, and Dean approached it with the intensity he'd once brought to his best work. On set, the younger actors watched him with respect earned not by reputation but by the dedication they saw every day, the professionalism that showed up in preparation and focus and willingness to do another take if the scene wasn't right. When the film premiered in 1970, critics who'd written him off as a has-been reconsidered their verdict, noting the depth and vulnerability he brought to his performance, qualities that had always been there but had gone dormant for too long. The picture became a huge hit, one of the biggest of the year, and suddenly Dean Martin was relevant again, not as a nostalgia act but as a working actor who'd rediscovered his craft. Frank called him the night after the premiere, slightly drunk and full of praise, and Dean could hear the relief in his voice, the gratitude that his friend had found his way back from whatever edge he'd been circling. "You scared us for a while there," Frank said, not bothering to hide it. "But you're back. The real you, not the lounge act version. Welcome home, Pally." Dean thought about telling Frank about Duke's visit that night in Tucson, about how close he'd come to letting it all slip away, but some things were private, were sacred, were meant to stay between the men who'd shared the moment. "Thanks for making that call," Dean said simply, and Frank knew exactly what he meant, knew that Dean knew about the worried phone call that had brought Duke to his door, and the acknowledgement sat between them like a gift neither man needed to unwrap. After they hung up, Dean poured himself a small drink, a real one this time instead of the larger and larger pours he'd been using to fill the emptiness, and raised his glass to the empty room, to absent friends and hard truths and second chances earned through work. The years that followed weren't perfect. Dean still made pictures he wasn't proud of, still had days where showing up felt like work in the worst sense of the word, still struggled with the gap between who he wanted to be and who he actually was. But something fundamental had shifted that night in Tucson, something in how he approached the work, how he measured success, how he defined what it meant to be a professional. He started mentoring younger performers, sharing what he'd learned about craft and dedication, about the difference between talent and discipline, about why the work mattered even when nobody was watching. He'd tell them the story about Rio Bravo, about how Hawks had pushed him beyond his comfort zone, about how working with Duke had taught him that acting wasn't about being comfortable but about being true, about finding something real in artificial circumstances and making audiences believe the lie enough to feel the truth underneath the eye. In 1979, 11 years after that conversation in the Arizona Inn, Dean got word that Duke was dying, that cancer was finishing what cigarettes and hard living had started, that the man who'd seemed indestructible was finally mortal after all. Dean flew to Newport Beach, talked his way past handlers and security, and sat beside Duke's bed for 2 hours, not saying much, just being present the way you are for people who matter. Near the end of the visit, when the light outside the window was fading and nurses were starting to hint it was time to go, Duke opened his eyes and looked at Dean with perfect clarity, seeing past the famous face to the man underneath. "You did good," Duke said, his voice rough but certain. "You did real good with the time you had left. I'm proud of you." Dean couldn't speak around the lump in his throat, couldn't find words adequate to the moment, so he just nodded and squeezed Duke's hand, hoping that was enough, hoping Duke understood that everything that had come after Tucson, every good performance, every moment of genuine craft, every time he'd chosen difficulty over ease, all of it traced back to that night, that conversation, that refusal to let him slide into comfortable irrelevance. Duke died on June 11, 1979, and at the funeral, Frank gave the eulogy, but Dean sat in the front row thinking about speed and skill, about temporary and forever, about how the work we leave behind is the only monument that matters. He thought about all the pictures they'd made together and separately, about how Duke's films would play for generations because he'd never stopped caring, never stopped pushing himself to find truth in the material, never betrayed the trust audiences placed in him when they bought their tickets and entered the dark. That was the legacy Dean wanted now, not the charming drunk or the crooner with the perfect timing, but the professional who honored his craft, who understood that talent was a gift that carried obligations, who believed that how you did anything was how you did everything. The lesson had cost him years he couldn't get back, relationships he couldn't repair, opportunities he'd squandered through indifference and self-protection. But he'd learned it eventually, had course-corrected before it was too late, and that had to count for something. Decades later, when film scholars and critics looked back at Dean Martin's career, they noticed something interesting, a clear dividing line in the late 1960s where his performances deepened, where the natural talent he'd always possessed became paired with discipline and intentionality, where he stopped coasting and started climbing again. They traced it to Airport, to his late-period work, to a renewed commitment nobody quite understood because nobody knew about a March evening in Tucson when John Wayne had driven in from location to tell an old friend the truth, not because it was easy but because it was necessary. The conversation had lasted less than an hour, but its effects rippled forward through time, changing the trajectory of a career, altering a legacy, proving that it's never too late to remember who you're supposed to be, never too late to choose dedication over default, never too late to honor the gifts you've been given by refusing to waste them. Dean Martin died in 1995, on Christmas Day, leaving behind a body of work that included both the forgettable and the extraordinary, the phoned-in and the transcendent, the evidence of a man who'd struggled with himself and ultimately found his way back to what mattered. At his memorial service, they showed clips from Rio Bravo and the Young Lions in Airport, and people remembered not just the charm and the voice and the effortless cool, but the depth underneath, the vulnerability he'd learned to access, the commitment he'd nearly lost and then recovered. Nobody mentioned speed because speed doesn't matter in retrospect, doesn't show up in the finished work, doesn't determine what endures. But skill was there in every frame worth remembering, skill and craft and the kind of dedication that transforms talent into art, that elevates entertainment into something approaching truth. That was what Duke had tried to tell him in Tucson, what Dean had finally understood. Speed fades with age and time and the inevitable erosion of years, but skill, real skill built on discipline and passion and respect for craft, that lasts forever, lives in the work, survives in the moments when an actor made audiences believe, really believe, in something larger than themselves. That's the only immortality any of us get, the only monument worth building, the only legacy that matters when the lights come up and the credits roll and the audience walks back out into their lives, changed in small ways by what they've witnessed, grateful to the artists who cared enough to make it real.